Here we go. So here is my workbench, and we're going to be looking at a sort of, it's going to start off quite abstract, and hopefully when we finish, it's going to look something like an image of a forest in the autumn, but it's going to be quite stylized and, you know, quite free. So if it ends up just being glorious patterns in beautiful autumn colors, doesn't really matter, does it? Because we're sort of letting our creativity go free a bit. So um, because we're sort of, what I'm imagining is these sort of like slightly aerial photographs. So you've got sort of, we're imagining we're up above the forest, sort of looking down. So the trees up here, or the shapes up here, are going to be as if they were in a distance, and then we're going to just have the sort of shapes down here will eventually become sort of a bit more front on. So these ones are going to be rounder, is basically what I'm saying, and the ones up here are going to be more like lines almost, and kind of blobs. And as they come down, they're going to get rounder and more blobby. That's about as high tech as I'm going to get, or sort of scientific as I'm going to get about this. I'm not going to do too much water on the page first. I want to kind of have wet brush splats, a bit more controlled than splats, but wet brush areas on a dry paper rather than having a completely wet surface. And we thought we're going to do autumn colours, so we're going to be very much hitting the orange and the sort of red and the rusty kind of colours. And I think we can be quite extreme with these because you can always deaden them down a bit later. So we're going to start off with some really strong orange. So I'm mixing up with my paints here, plenty of water, plenty of pigment, but some lovely bright rich orange colours. And we're thinking of those sort of Scandinavian or North American kind of birch forests where you get this beautiful tone of colour in the autumn. So I want fairly wet paint, or watery paint really, because I mean it's all going to be wet paint, isn't it? But and then I'm going to start with just sort of um, big fat brush, just areas of colour on the surface, and I want some drips to happen. I want there to be drips because they're going to be eventually going to help us get the sense of trunks and sort of tree trunks and forests kind of happening. So I've just got a lovely sort of orangey splat there with a long drip coming down. As soon as I've got one on, I'm going to slightly change my pigment. So I'm going to slightly add some pinky brown, some pinky red, or some russet, whatever color you want to, into that paint to start, so that there's a little bit of differentiation between the two. But what we're aiming is this sort of like lollipop kind of idea. So we get a nice lot of wet paint, and we get a big fat dribble happening right down the middle in our sort of first row of trees. This will be one where you want the paper to be propped up, and you want to probably, which I don't have, is a piece of something protecting your floor down below, because there may be some drips disappearing off onto your carpet and whatever else is below there. So let's take another one, again just in the orangey colour, but we can get once you get one orange colour on, we can then get some red and come back in with a second sort of layer, a darker colour in at the bottom to start adding a bit of sort of shadow. There we go, there's my drip. Come on, trunk, you've got to get all the way to the ground. I hope you've got a hairdryer handy, because we may need to sort of do a bit of hair drying on these. So if you, like me, look, you've got a reluctant trunk, a bit more pigment, a bit more water into the bottom of that, just to sort of supercharge it a bit. If it's really not going to go, we'll brush into the water and put a drop of water on, and that'll push it down quite handily. So with these ones I've got here, they're already fading quite a bit because they're getting absorbed into the paper. So we can come back with some extra pigment and colours. Keep it onto the bottom half to begin with, because if we're thinking about the way sort of shadow and shading kind of works, we're going to get that darker colour in at the bottom. I want to get a yellowy one into this side now. I want to get sort of, so I'm going to try and brighten up my colour with lots of yellow paint. This is definitely a case where it might be good to have a couple of different water pots, so you can keep, because if we're going to be using yellow tones, it's very easy for yellow tones to get mucky off the water that you're using. So we can add, get some more yellow into it, because that's still quite orangey, and I wanted to get really sharper yellow tone, but don't have to worry about that too much. But I want to get some yellow in to that. Let's add it up. Let's get some more yellow into that, and that's hopefully has got some sort of ochre kind of colour. So we've got our 3 or 4 sort of like starting off tree points, and then we're going to just come behind those. We want to choose a different colour to sit behind them, so we also want to be in the red sort of orangey zone, so try and mix up a slightly different tone. And we're going to come in, but I don't want to come directly like touching these at the moment. We might come back and alter them first, but you want to leave like a slightly white margin just above that sort of shape, but just and sort of like a very blobby rainbow kind of feel, like a sort of almost like you're putting a hat on it. We're just going to leave that top half so it's like a little white at the moment. So it's just sort of like a little arch of orangey colour there. And then we're going to go on. I would make this paint slightly less runny than your first level because we're going to need less drips with this one. So then we're going to come in with the yellow. We don't have to be too ordered, so it'd be quite good if they start sort of overlapping a bit on some other ones. And where you've got that yellow nice and bright, you might come in and add a bit of yellow extra into some of these ones, sort of change the shape. It doesn't really matter what shape these are going to be because they'll all start hopefully to work together. And then I want to get another red one here, so I need to go a bit darker maybe into this one here. And if you do get another drop, it doesn't matter because we're going to have lots of forest kind of stuff happening down the bottom. So I'm mixing up a red, and then this one I'm going to take it again over top. I want to sort of overlap with this one as well because I don't want it to become too formal and sort of like arranged if someone's planted it. So I'm just getting a sort of this shape, this half moon disappearing up behind this yellow one here. So that's sort of just starting to get layers and things happening. And while I've got that red on my brush, I'm going to bring in a little bit of red behind here, just sort of coming into that area there, a little bit of white and just some brush marks in there because we can eventually start working on those and giving them sort of more definition. Now we've got this one here, so you want something to contrast with here. I mean, you can go completely psychedelic with your forest. You can have all sorts of colours happening because it's a forest of the imagination, so your imagination can run riot. But I'm going to try and get a more yellowy tone in here. Again, just you see into that sort of shape there, and then bring that arc of it up. And you can do one that's slightly taller. You know, we can do a sort of slightly so it almost comes like a sort of diamond shape behind there, just to sort of get a bit of difference in. If that's going to run, let it, because we want some more things to run through. And then we can again go something darker here. So I'm going to go into quite a pinky red into this corner here. Bring that up so it's nice and whatever shape really. You can do a round shape, half round, but half rainbow like that. So now we've got like hopefully the sense of some sort of things moving backwards through space. And we can put, it's kind of weird because almost what we're doing with these sort of drips down the bottom is we're sort of actually trying to paint the space in between the forest because we almost want to let these drips become like we want to leave the whiteness of the paper rather than have the drip as being the trunk. So I'm going to build up again a little bit more colour, and we're trying to get some drips to come alongside now. So you want ideally, we see this controlled drippery. We want to try and get a drip to come alongside like that. And then same sort of in here, so we can come in here with our paint tone and build up a little reservoir of paint where we want that drip to happen. And hopefully we can get a bit, let's get a bit more water on that. And there we go, let's pull that down there. So that's starting to, we're sort of like, you can see this is kind of actually going to become our trunk sort of area. And as one started here, but I'm going to try and see if I can get one to go in behind. So it's quite fun trying to be quite, trying to make drips do what you want them to do. You know, it's a bit like herding cats. But if we get them started and then sort of pump a bit of water and paint through them, you can see that just sort of allows one to happen where you want it to go. And we're going to keep on adding drips into this section because this is going to be very much sort of like the trunks of the trees sort of looking through. So once you've got some going, now what would be quite, I think, work really quite well at this point was going to be to tilt the canvas because we don't necessarily want to have all our trees straight like that, because if you look through a forest you get some sort of angle. The trees don't always grow in perfection. So I'm going to slightly get some paint on my brush. This is slightly strained exercise. I'm having to sort of balance all these things together. I don't want to turn it through 90 degrees, but I'm going to give it a tilt like that. So you can imagine it's like a 30-degree angle off the base. And then I want to get a drip to run, and I'm going to hope that I've got enough water. If you paint on the brush, I'm going to put a little bit of extra water in. If these ones are paler, that's fine. So we're going to let that go off at that angle. Now you can add a little extra water, and you can even just bring it down. Look, just like rock it back again at the last minute, and that's what brings it back down to earth. So you might have wanted to watch that one, see what I do. We'll do another one. So I'm going to get a bit more watery paint on my brush. I'm having to put my paint palette down behind me and sort of move around in lots of strange ways to get this to work. But I'm just going to tilt again and build up a little reservoir of paint at the top there, and add a little bit of water. There it goes, and then I can just sort of bring it back to straight, so that therefore it starts off at an angle, and then it's going to go down. And I'm just going to draw my curtain a bit, because I think that's better, so you can see those sort of drips a bit more. That's it. So we're going to do another one, but I'm going to tilt the other way this time. So we're going to get like, and that's just giving us a kind of a different feel to the tree trunks. It's getting them to sort of cross and behind, and you can see how where you've got lighter colours and they're fading back into the distance, and that's sort of working quite nicely. I'm going to tilt this way now with this one. So again, just pressing the brush on to get some a reservoir of paint building up, and then if you want to get it to drop and it's not dropping, get your brush in some water and then it'll go. And it's done a lovely bump there because it's just hit a bulge in the paper, and that's kind of cool. And that's good. So this one here, this one hasn't grown properly, so let's give him a little extra encouragement with a bit more water. Come on, you can do it. There you go. There you go. Go on, you can be a big trunk too, all the way down. And I'm seeing there's quite a big space here on mine. You might have a different space on yours, or you might have a space somewhere else, but I want to kind of avoid that. So I'm going to get another one to start from here. I want to get through that space there. And because I've got this line sort of coming diagonally to that way, I'm going to try and get one to sort of mirror it and go that way this time. So let's get a little bit more pigment. I'm going for quite a ruby pink this time, but again, you can change. We'll start bringing some brown tones in as well. So then if I tilt this that way a bit more, that's it. And then I can get my paint. I'm going to bring it from over here, and then got a little reservoir of paint there. And again, just by using the water, it means that the drip that comes off is going to be paler. And I think that's going to start to add to that feeling of things moving backwards into the depth of the forest. Like that. And then I want to do a couple more just into those larger spaces that I've got, and you can just do a little bit of twisting and sort of encouraging to get the drip to kind of do some different shapes. If they cross each other, let's see if we can get one to cross each other, because I think that could be quite interesting. I think to do that, we're going to need to tilt it at quite a big angle. So go on, little drop, you can do it all the way down. Come on, there we go. So I've just encouraged him with the brush to make sure it goes all the way down. Right, and then this one, I want to try and get something to cross through there. So let's get a bit more paint on. And we can just move that to the side like that. And then let's try and get one to come across, because there's always a tree trunk that's fallen down. But it's quite tricky because they like following the paths of least resistance, which are the bits that have already been done for them. So, well, we're getting some cross shapes in there. I think that's still adding to the effect of things all being, oops, get a lovely view of my scruffy sitting room. My son's trampoline in it. Right, so this is like starting to get this feeling of all this sort of like trunks, and that sort of where you're looking through a forest, and after a while you sort of can't see them all because you sort of literally can't see the wood for the trees. You've just got all this crisscross of line work kind of going across in front of you and fading off into the distance. So that is starting to, I'm quite happy with the way that's sort of coming on. So we'll come back to that bit later. We're going to have to dry it off in a bit, but now we need to look at the top half of a bit more. So this is where the limitations of camera ratios come in, because this doesn't like filming portrait images, and we have got a sort of portrait image here. So we're going to continue these colours going back into this sort of distance up here. As we go back, we're going to see longer and thinner forms. So we're not going to see so much roundness, but we're going to see little peaks of colour above the line work. I'm not worrying about if you get a drip at all like that over the top, because this is kind of, it's a very impressionistic, very sort of messy way of working, and we can have fun with that later. You know, fun with drips. That's going to be my it sounds like a proper 1970s schools teaching series. So these ones are just becoming, again, areas of colour, just little mounds of colour. Think more sort of stretching out rather than being too tall. Because as things disappear off into the distance, you're only going to be seeing the tips of the canopies of these little trees that we've got happening here. So I can just fill in sort of side bit there, and then because I've got that nice orange colour on my brush, I can take that into that side there. So it's kind of linking those sort of two across. And you know, we can really use the most beautiful reds and oranges sort of going back here and getting some really, because you've seen, like, if you see a forest in full autumn, it does look incredible. And I'm just sort of bringing little hints of sort of brush marks coming through, and I'm not worrying too much about what they do and where they go. We will work with this, and we're going to add sort of leaf textures and things to them. So we're coming back further and further, just moving back across, and the further back we go, the more kind of distance we're going. So as we go back, we might want to go paler. So we've got sort of quite a band of orange there. So I'm going to come in with more of a yellow colour. And so as we go back, we're going to yellow, and we're getting sort of just little sort of dabs of paints coming through. And then we can then change to, I'm going to go into some sort of browner tone. So I'm going to use a bit of ochre, keeping the paint not too wet at this point. So it's more dry paint on a dryish, well, it's not really dry, but not as wet as we were doing when we were trying to get the drips to happen, because we're just going to keep seeing these hints of a background moving back like that. And then that's starting to give us, though it's still sort of very abstract, we're getting this feeling of things sort of moving away into a sort of distance. You could completely do the whole page and disappear off into the so you don't see any sort of sky. I think we'll just do a little bit more, and then we'll call a sort of whole, I don't know if we're going to put a sky in, we'll see how we feel. I don't know how literal we want to be, because we're going to get quite pattern based with the sort of surface of the trees and sort of give them quite a decorative feel. We're not definitely trying to do a nature study here. This is very impressionistic. And then while I've got my paint going, I'm going to go with some slightly darker brown tones. And I want to come back into these ones at the front and using quite for watercolors, quite thick dry paint, just get some little areas of shadow into the bottom of these, just by pulling in shapes into that initial blob that we did at the beginning. So see where you've got a drip there, you can kind of disappear it in by working over the surface. And I'm still just using the same old square brush, which I tend to use for everything, which I'm sure is terribly bad form, but I find it really useful. And I don't want to start getting into painting sort of sweeps, like sort of swags, because it'll start looking like sort of chintzy curtains. So just by using the edge of the brush to sort of put in edge work and sort of just blocks of colour, rather than trying to get too sweepy, it actually sort of, I think, has a more leaf-like kind of feel. And then again, I'm just going to leave those tops white at the moment, because we've got to imagine that's where the light is hitting our trees. So coming behind those with a bit of shadow, each one, so where you've got a yellowy one, try and then use like a sort of yellow ochre to kind of dab in a colour, just to sort of start adding a bit of dimension. So when you've got this red one, then go to your red paints and get a darker version of the red. You're not sure how to darken it, a tiny hint of brown into red will give you a darker version without killing the colour. As I always say to people, just avoid using, if things are black in your picture, obviously paint them black, but try and avoid using black to create shadow, because it doesn't quite, unless the shadow is very definitely black. If you try and add black into red, for example, to make a dark red, you tend to get quite a muddy sort of dull colour. Whereas if you use a brown, or even the opposite colour, a dark green, that will give you a truer representation of shadows on red, because you have to remember, as the shadow falls on a thing, it's still the same color underneath the shadow, or the shadow's on top of its color. So that helps to get that tonal kind of feel. So just by using the side of the sort of bottom edge of the brush and just sort of moving it across, it's giving me the sort of feel of foliage without trying to draw in hundreds of leaves. So it's almost like a crosshatch with that wet end of a brush, and just to sort of start getting some shadow. And as you go up, you can have less detail because, of course, as things move away, then you don't see as much as much of what is going on, sorry, as you do when you're close up. So the detail becomes a lot more broken up. And I think I might change my brush for so that I'm not just using the same brush for the entire painting, the entire painting pot. So I can come back and on the very top row, just work some little dabbing sort of movements along that very top edge, just to start getting the furthest away kind of autumn trees sort of going on. Now, I think I will want to do something with the trunk area down here. Having said that, I like the white trunks. I do really like the red trunks as well. So we'll have to think about that as we go. We might have to have red trunks, but then it's sort of like classically, the birch trees had these very white trunks against this sort of dark background. So we'll see how our brain works as we're going through this. Right, okay, so this is my sort of base. I'm not going to do a lot more paint on that because I'm quite happy where I am. The only thing I'm going to do is to get my big brush again and dry it on my trousers because I can't get to a tissue, and use quite a thick yellow paint. So thick means not very much water, quite just a damp brush onto that paint surface, just to bring some yellow into the tops of these trees. So where we've left that white, that gives us a lovely white background to just work on. And it's almost like an underpainting. So it lets you bring a bit of light and life into that highlight on the tree, but you don't want to have it pure white because it'll start to look too much like the tree's got sort of snow on it. So I've left that white paper in reserve so I can come back with a drier brush, and it gives that yellow, that real sort of oomph for having white behind it. And the same on these, where it's paler, I can go in now it's slightly drier and just flick some yellow, because you get that lovely long sunshine, sort of low angle sunshine in the autumn, which really brings out these sort of colours. Okay, so that is now all I'm going to do with my paint on this one. So if we were doing this not on camera, we might well go and have a cup of tea and let this sit for half an hour, but we're going to now get the hair dryers. So I'm going to mute for a minute and just hair dry this off, just so that we can then start thinking about the pen work on top of this. Okay, so I'm going to mute and grab my hair dryer. Right, so that is dry enough to work in. I think the colours look a lot stronger in the reality compared to what the camera sees, unfortunately, but there is a really nice intense colour happening on here, which does feel very autumny. So we want to then use our pen and ink work to kind of work on top of this base that we have, to create this sense of this sort of forest happening. And so I think I wouldn't be frightened of getting quite dark with some of the pen work in here, particularly in this sort of section here, because it's going to really make this kind of stand out. So I'm going to start off with where is it, my point? I'm looking for a 0.4 or 0.5, something like that. You know, I have so many pens around me and every one I pick up is always the wrong size. Right, so here is a 0.4. So I'm thinking about the line work. So we want to give the impression of this sort of bushy foliage, but we don't want to sit there doing individual leaves, because that's going to get too kind of just drive us nuts. I know people do that, but I want to try and, so I want to think about this almost like clouds maybe, or sort of like clusters of sort of shapes. So and also we want to reference the paint marks that you've got going on here. So we're going to just use quite a simple kind of wiggly line kind of approach, but just moving around the paint areas that we've got. So where you've got a nice edge of paint, you can come in, let me zoom in on this one a bit, so you can see that we're coming around the sort of shapes that the brush has given us, and then sort of coming around the side. And again, the old maxim is that, you know, where you get more lines closely together, that's where you get areas of shadow and that sort of softness. So the wiggliness of the line kind of gives the feeling of foliage, but it's not trying to be every single leaf. So where you want to get some shadowing, you can do some extra lines sort of following the first ones that you get down. And we're concentrating at the moment on this sort of bottom half of the tree, because obviously this is the tree that's part of the tree that's going to be in the most shadow. So trying to sort of imagine it and see it in your head as a sort of block, much more like a sort of cotton wool ball on a stick, rather than trying to draw every single leaf that comes into the tree. That's always sort of difficult when you're starting out and you want to do sort of tree studies or think about trees, is that people see the structure, unless it's in stark winter kind of leafless guise, people kind of try and draw the structure of the tree, the arms and the sort of branches, and they get too far into the detail, and then it's very hard to see that because it's all kind of hidden behind this mass of leaves. So if you kind of try and see it as almost like a solid object with sort of areas of light and dark in it, and I think that can be a way of getting across this feeling of this sort of the chunkiness of the trees sort of coming down. So if we're going to try and make these stalks, or the sort of drips, they're kind of like the space in between. So we're going to come down the side of that trunk sort of in darkness, and then we can take another side line down here, and that then sort of becomes the white of that sort of birch trunk. And I'm just zipping off the screen a bit, and then again this is going to be the gap through here. So we're going to see this sort of whiteness as being our trunk. So then that's going to come, and so I'm imposing a line on that space to get that sort of space in there. And then I'm just going to keep on drawing with that down, and we'll see how this develops, and we'll get this feeling. And then in between some of these white shapes, we may well come in with colors and pattern to kind of darken them down so they disappear off. So like, so that these become trunks at different distances away from us. But I think just getting this kind of like long tangle effect of all these things overlapping, so we can again take some shapes, some long thin shapes through that space and bring them down, carrying them on behind. So we're getting that sort of interweaving kind of feel, like this, sort of taking it through all these sort of layers. But then again, back on this one, and think about where these sort of trees meet, and underneath here, this is where we want to get more line work. We want to get more kind of shadow happening. So if we get the basic outline in first, and then following that again, it puts another layer of pen work, so it's going to make that darker, it's going to give it more shadow and more sort of form. And still just looking into that paint and seeing where you've got a brush edge that you can exaggerate by going around, that you can pick out, because that will sort of give that line a reason to go somewhere. So look here, I've got quite a nice, on this one here, and just tilt the camera that way, it doesn't like going. I've got this nice sort of line of paint here, so I can really pick that out, and then that becomes sort of an area of highlights a bit more than the sort of darkness. So I'm just working that pen line and just letting it go with the paint and traveling through, but thinking all this time that sort of shimmering quality that you get. So my line needs to sort of shimmy and shake, because the leaves and the trees are going to be shimmying and shaking sort of around. And to show you what I mean with the sort of the darkness, once you've got like a space that is definitely going to be background, we can get some pen work in, and we can be quite graphic with it. We can just shade in with some fine lines close together, but that's going to push that space into the background. It's going to be inside the very depth of the forest sort of feel. But this is just using this line work now as shading, and we could be more dramatic and completely colour it in black, but this will start to be shaded. It'll make more sense really when I come and do the next area. But if I just finish off this little section here, and then this is going to stay white because it's a trunk, but then if I then come in behind that, I'd probably take a little bit more time over it, but I'm being a little bit fast. But you can see how that starts to push backwards so that the white is standing out against it in the way that sort of tree trunks do. Particularly where you've got these sort of birch trees that have these very silvery white, but when they're young, they have silvery white bark, hence they're being known as silver birches. But if I push that down, that you can see how that's starting to make this pop forwards. So I'm going to continue just shading that down into the edge, into the edge of this sort of shape here. And you could be very, I said, very dramatic and get a brush pen and just literally black these areas out, because after about 4 trees in, then you're really not seeing very much because the canopy above is so dense that you don't see a lot of light. So it becomes very sort of that sort of dark and spooky feel. And I find that if you get near the top of these shapes, if you then go back and add some more lines in just to sort of get some darkness in, and where this trunk is going up into the canopies of disappearing here, if we just put a little small, widely spaced, but still some black lines in there, it just gives it that little bit of shadows and it disappearing up. So like this one here, just a few lines, and it's giving it a little tonal quality that help push it back. And then here, this has got to be a space here, so this becomes a dark space, and almost into that very top of the shape, we can almost color it completely black so that it's disappearing in. And I don't mind, you could, if you wanted to, make all these lines add up, but I quite like them not, I mean, sort of link up, not add up, that's maths, but link up. But I quite like them not doing that, because it takes it away again from being totally representational. It gives it a more kind of decorative quality, which I'm quite in favour of. So if we keep on down into that shape there, and then you can see how that's become sort of darkness and shadow. And so now I can see how dark this is. I can think, right, I need to come back into this area on this tree and get some more quite nice undulating lines. But even though using a very undulating line, a wiggly line, layering them together, putting them next to each other really close, is still going to give me that shadowed feel. So although I'm not using a straight line, it's still going to bring tone as much as it's going to bring form. But by doing wiggles, it helps describe the different surfaces. So you've got wiggly tree and straight trunk. There we go. So with this one, this is my main trunk here. So this red section that we've done as a drip, I'm going to push that back by doing lines across it in the same. So it's going to come a dark hole, but it's going to have that hint of color through it as well. And I think that's quite interesting because it has that feeling of, the leaves have fallen into the forest. There's a bit of edge here, so I'm going to imagine that I can just see that popping up through there, and I can take that one down. And down here where you've got this, I've got this one that I've drawn crossing. I just want to continue that down and continue that down, you see, and then that starts to make sense. And I can see, right, that definitely is a sort of dark hole there. And then this red trunk is coming down here, and there's a little bit of space there for that white one to move around. So it's all these sort of layers of color and different tonal sections give us this feeling of distance. Now I'm sort of going to work in a slice through this painting so that you can see how I do the different depths of the trees, because I could just do all this front row and then I wouldn't have done anything at the back during our session. So I'm hoping that will be a way to show you all the sort of approaches that I use or would use for this sort of piece. So I'm just taking that all the way down there. So here again, I need to get some, this is going to become dark shadow here. So let's get that in. And there's sort of a branch, this is a trunk kind of here. So let's get that bit of dark shadow in. And often what I talk about is when you're doing an artwork, you shouldn't, I know people do try and do photo real drawings, and I've got no, they're amazing what they do. But with this sort of thing, we're not trying to do photorealism. What we're doing really is creating a language that speaks to our viewer through the marks that we make. So we know this isn't a photographic representation of a birch forest, but we're saying, right, when I do straight lines, that's forest distance, that's the gaps between the trees. So I'm going to stick to that all the way through, because that's kind of what we're agreeing here. We're saying when I want to show the distance between the trees, I'm going to fill them in with these lines of these conflicting lines of tone and shade like this. So that's how I know that that's space. And then on my tree, when I want to do leaf textures, I'm going to do wiggly lines, because this is the deal that we've got going here, people. We're saying, right, wiggly lines, that means tree. So that sounds like, we're creating a visual language, sounds very sort of arty and pretentious, but it's not really. It's just sort of saying, this is our understanding. It is like any other language. We've all agreed in English that that symbol, the triangle with a line through it, when we see that, we say a. And that's an understanding that we've all agreed on at some point in our history. And in a weird kind of way, you're creating your own little bit of language for each individual artwork that you do. We're saying, this is not a photograph, this is a sweep of paint on the page, but this is my sweep of paint that means this. And so this is what we're doing with these trees. So we can get quite curly and swirly. We can really build some quite nice undulating patterns in. We haven't got to be in any way totally realistic. So like we can do some lovely paint swirls in and follow those together. And we're still okay, because this is a tree. So we've got this lovely agreement now that trees can be swirly. So we can have swirly trees. We can create these big swoopy patterns onto them. And then we can echo that swoop to create a bit of shade and a bit of tone. And because we're using these soft lines, and because we see the sort of outline of a tree is this of lovely soft sort of cotton wool ball kind of shape, we can keep using these sort of lines and find really nice patterns inside the paint to follow, and throw in some little curly flourishes and then just follow them and echo them. And it starts to have that feeling of leaves and treetops, because we've made that, we've got that deal going now. We can say, right, these are my trees have swirly lines on them. There's a very famous painting by an artist, René Magritte, and it's a picture of a pipe, and it has written above it in French, which I won't do because my accent's terrible, this is not a pipe. And it was sort of like the heralding of the sort of start of the surrealist art movement and also modern art movements. But really what he was saying, I think, with it is that it's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. And I think by saying that, it actually gives you freedom to say, well, this may be how someone else draws something, but I'm going to draw it like this because I like drawing it like this. And that's kind of what finding your artistic voice is all about, is saying, when I draw things, this is how I'm going to draw them. And if I'm bold enough and comfortable enough in my abilities, I will draw these things and you'll get on board with that idea, and we'll both create a wonderful artwork between us. It's always very interesting to think, does an artwork exist if nobody ever sees it? Is it enough that it exists for you, or do you need to have someone else to look at it to appreciate it for it to become sort of real? Well, I'm getting very arty and philosophical this afternoon, aren't I? Let's just think about the nicer, the nice wiggles and squiggles. But it's just interesting to think about it. So really, that's what I'm sort of saying is, so where we want to, so I've got some white paper showing through here on the side, and that's sort of slightly messing things up because it's looking too bright. So I can sort of solve that by going in and building up some swirls and some squiggles to show where they sort of overlap. And then if that looks too bold, then I have to go back in and do some swirls and squiggles quite close to it to sort of like soften that, so it's less impactful, by bringing in some more dark and sort of shadow around it. And then when I get up here, look, because this is sort of the top of this tree, I don't want to put any real marks up on here because this is all lovely and light at the moment. But this tree behind, this is going to be the backdrop for this one. So in here, I can start getting some really nice tight, because I want to get some shadow sort of showing around that edge. So some really tight squiggly squiggles kind of happening through there. And I can pick out that top edge. Remember how that thing I said before, if you can't make something lighter to make it stand out, then make the stuff around it darker to make it stand out, because that's what you can control, particularly with watercolors. if you had acrylic paints and you were doing this, you could go back and shovel on some white acrylic and white it out, but you can't with watercolor. And so with that, because I want this to be in the background, I'm going to go in and put plenty of squiggly swirls into that edge, into that tree behind. Still following my paint shapes, but just making sure that and you can see how now this tree is really popping out at the foreground. This is all still lovely and sunny, and this is sort of pushing back. Same with this one here. So I'm going round the edge of this one. And again, it doesn't really matter what shape blob you've got, because you'll find that trees are all sorts of shapes. So we're quite happy to accept that they could be all sorts of, fantastic shapes around there. So again, I can follow around that edge. And then this area here, I want this to be darker because I need it to push in. So my wiggly lines is going to be coming into that shape there and packing in nice and tight. So I can see a little line of light paint there. So let's leave that sort of as a highlight and then darken up sort of around that in the same sort of way. So that's hopefully going to make all these trees in the front start to sort of pop out and move forwards. And still thinking about the paint shapes that you've got, but also thinking if they're not brilliant, they're not working for you, then you can sort of overrule them and come in and impose some patterns and some shapes on them. You could get a lot more patterny with it. You could do some very quite controlled swirls, and I think it would still work if that's what you decide to do over the whole piece. You could still have like peacock feather kind of designs or half moons. You could be really, really quite ordered and regulated with it, and it would still work beautifully, because again, you're going to say, right, for these trees, they're all going to have perfect little half moons of shadow on them to create shadow, and I bet it would work beautifully, and it would still be really effective. So again, I'm going to come in behind this one, and to get that sort of dark shadow, I'm going to do real sort of almost on top, real, not scribbles, but like figure eight, sort of really pack those lines in dark together to kind of build up that area of shadow. And then as we come up this tree, the scribbles are going to spread out a bit, and I'm going to let more background show through, and that immediately makes that a bit paler and a bit lighter. So again, if I just swing back and we have a little moment, you can start to see how these are sort of popping and pushing back where they need to and coming forwards and being brighter when they need to as well. And so if we come down to our sort of tangle of trunks here, I think this area here, that needs to go dark. So I can put in my lines across there, and just as tight as you can get them with leaving a tiny piece of white. And if you don't always get the white to show, that's fine, because it is meant to be shadow, so we can get that in darker. And I like the sort of the way the lines are all doing slightly different things, because again, it has a sort of slightly chaotic feel in the way natural environments do. They have a chaotic rhythm, they all work beautifully, but sometimes it looks quite overwhelming. And then up here, I'm going to make sure I put a little bit of shadow on here, probably do it at a different angle to the shadow that are next to it, so it doesn't blend into it too much. So this shadow here, I'm going to do this bit a little bit straighter, because I've got lines going one way and lines going another. This needs to be knocked back even further. This needs to become darker, because I've got that going through there. And even if you get completely lost and you end up colouring in something that was meant to be a trunk, don't worry about it. Just do a few more, and then it just adds to that slightly crazy higgledy-piggledy kind of feel when you're looking into a forest and you can't see your way through. But you want, the dog's gone in there, so you've got to go after them, sort of thing. And you're like, oh no, in there? Really? Okay. You may have realised I've had dogs in the past that do that to me a lot, disappear off into intensely deep bits of woodland full of brambles and nettles, and then you sort of stagger in after them and they appear behind you going, what are you doing in there? I've done that bit, So you're just going to fill that space in sort of dark. And if you want to get it really dark, you can then get, I quite use a brush pen a lot for sort of really dark shadows, but I can come in and just flick a little bit of, actually just colour in that space into a sort of dark. And if I'm doing it near the top like that, it really sort of adds into the shadow kind of feel, into the sort of forest, like that. And then so that it's not too stark, so there's not too much of a join between the darkness, I can do a little bit of cross hatching going the other way, coming out of that, again as a sort of tonal stage between those sort of two areas. And again, when you get down to here, I think when you get down to the points and the bottoms of the shape, again, if you sort of build that tone up with the sort of line work, it just really adds to that sense of depth. And then up on the top of the trees here, because we've got white trees there, this red that needs to push back a bit further because I want those white trees to pop out. So if you want to push some, make something move away or look further away, you make it darker. And then you can make the white, put a little bit of shadow on the top of those white trees so that they're disappearing into the tree canopy and not standing out proud. Right, so let's take this, build another line sort of through there and bring that down into that space. And that can be shadow, and this is going to be a tree trunk behind. So we're now seeing the drips are becoming the tree trunks that are like the next rank of tree trunks, as it were, you know, sort of with the white ones right on top. And the drips are the ones that are the sort of the next layer in, because the hint of colour on them really helps to make them recede back a bit again. And I think this sort of image would be really lovely to then work into a collage and then to maybe add some figures and things. I think it's the sort of thing you can imagine sort of quite high-end greeting cards like this, with these lovely sort of trees or fabric. I mean, I think when you, if you did the whole piece, it would be a beautiful piece of fabric design. I could see this as at the hem of a big skirt, you know, all this sort of like forest skirt. I'm always finding I'm a very applied arts kind of a person, so I don't tend to just do things in because you know I immediately start imagining what they'd be like as sort of tea canisters and all sorts of things. So right, this one's got to be a dark space, so let's push that back. So yeah, I'm always looking for the practical angle. I remember putting a picture up on Facebook, and Facebook has this habit of slightly rounding the corners of your images. And somebody put, "Oh, that would make a lovely table mat," and somehow I felt a bit deflated at that point. I think, oh, and I think my drawing's worth more than a table mat that you don't see half the time because you've got your plate on it. But never mind. Right, so we're just going to add a little bit more tone into those. This is going to be a space here, this long space here. So I'm going to push some shading into that. And I think this is where this sort of technique works so well. I love this combination of these very graphic black lines that are almost like classic cartoon kind of shading, but then with that very soft colour provided by the watercolour. There's something so lovely when these two come together because they're quite opposite sort of media. And I think that sometimes when you can bring two different styles together, you get a lovely result because they're not fighting each other, but they're also not they're also standing proudly apart from each other. And I think it works really well because it does have this sort of it has both a flat quality and a 3D quality somehow, which I think is fascinating that it manages to do both things at once. So we're starting to get some really nice depth happening in here. And I love all these sort of like, I don't think want to try and make the lines. It's funny because these lines are being very descriptive in lots of ways. They're making the trees look leafy and sort of fluffy. And these lines are sort of quite graphic and not very realistic. And I think that's actually working really beautifully. It's doing something really interesting. And I hope you're finding interesting too. So we've got red tree trunks there, and then we want to have a white tree trunk coming up in between those two. So I'm just imagining that I'm actually just drawing the edge, but I'm following the shapes that are there. And then we can do a sliver of black or shading alongside the white trunks so that they start to pop forwards. And again, with these drips here, you've got some lovely edges to follow where it's sort of spread on the paper. So it's a way of getting some sort of knobbly textures into your trunks and stopping them just being flat surfaces, and it gives them sort of surface as well. So let's have a look back at the trees. Let's go into this one. I've got this drip coming down to this one, and I want to slightly disguise that. So I'm going to just do some of my line work over the top. And sometimes where you've got these like yellow isolated brush marks, you can come under and just give them a little wiggle of shadow underneath. And that starts to sort of, again, help them stand out. We need to get some shadow into this side here because we're just filling into that sort of space. Using that line again, so it's all about describing the surface and bringing tone as well, so that our lines are doing sort of two jobs each time. And this one here has got some nice dark shapes in it, so I want to sort of bring those through, and plenty of pen work on that to really layer that on to get some deep tones happening. This one is going to be sort of more tonal and darker. And if we come up and see where we are here, look, we've got, if we just move up the camera a little bit to see how we get up to the top. As you get up higher, and we're going to start losing a lot of detail and a lot of definition because we're moving away, this might be the time to switch to a finer pen, because by doing that, you're also going to automatically create finer lines and patterns. This needs some more. Just notice that needs some more texture, and I can't leave that. You need to sort of, if you swap the pens, it gives you a thinner line. So let's demonstrate that by swapping the pen. So I'm going down to, I've got a 0.4, so I want something like a 0.2, which inevitably will be hiding, refusing to show its face. Aha, gotcha, right, so there we go. So if I come straight into this sort of area up here, just by using that pen that's thinner, it automatically gives me a lighter line because there's less of it, and it adds to that sense of distance. So as you go up and in the picture, you can do the same sort of techniques by using the wiggled line and the shape to define the leaves and the shapes. But you might also want to go up in pen, go down in pen size. So by the time you get to the back, you might be on usually the finest one you get in most pen sets is a 0.05, half a millimeter. So that would be what you'd be doing. And you can do less patterns. You don't have to do, this is where you want your most intense patterns. As you go up, you may just put in a few little defining wiggles just to help separate out some of the tree tops and just to sort of put in some of the shadow areas that you see. And you might also find that you change your line as well. So instead of doing some quite extravagant wiggles, it may just be some more like dotted lines or some little tiny smaller scale wiggles. So as you move up and away, the scale of your wiggle is going to get smaller. And on the actual trees in the foreground here, you can do the same kind of thing, because in amongst these sort of lovely big wiggles, if you come back with your finer pen and do follow some of these shapes, you're going to, because the pen is a thinner line, you're going to be putting less pen on the paper, so your lines are more delicate. So it's like another way of producing intermediate tones, sort of like not as dark as the full pen, but just to give a little sort of hint into that space of some of these sort of paint shapes that you've got, just to sort of outline them and give that feeling again of rustling leaves sort of on the trees. And of course, the same is true is that if you then go onto the bottom of the trees with a heavier pen, you can add in some stronger line work, and that again gives the bottom of the tree kind of weight and presence. So we're just putting these lines through and into those sort of shapes, and you can just build up under where you've got like a nice light bit sticking out. You can come in and kind of do some lighter pen work, squiggles and swirls kind of in there to create some areas and shadows and some depth. And as you come down to the bottom, you could go in with the light pens and really sort of pack in some wiggles into some of those shapes and get them really dark and get some tone happening. And almost up in these ones up the top here, you hardly need to do very much at all. You can just put little hints of edge work in to begin with. You might decide that when you get a lot more into these areas that you want to keep working up here and kind of bring some in, and that's fine. But I think if we focus on the front first, and then you can sort of like tone it back. And of course, this is where you can use colored pens as well. You could absolutely, and I think it would look really beautiful to then use orange and red and yellow fine liners on these sort of colors too. I think it gives it a really, there's something very satisfying about using the same color to outline the paint. You know, it seems to work really well. It would be more subtle, but I think it would be a really, really interesting look. And then of course you could go in with your metallics And I think some golds and copper kind of colours into the canopies of these trees would really sort of get that autumnal feel kind of going across the whole piece. So yeah, so we're starting to get, I think if we get more of this sort of bottom, if we just sort of, whoops, oh, drat, hit the camera. If we just look at this section here, if I put sort of blanket out, you can see how when you focus in on it, that really starts to have this incredible sense of depth. And suddenly that does become much more sort of tonal, much more feeling that you can kind of go in there. So we'll get some more depth into this bottom section, because I think that will start to, this is going to be where you want to do the most of your work, because this is the section of the picture that's sort of closer to us, really. So we want to get loads of areas of shadow and darkness into this sort of section. And this could be somewhere where you could draw, some faces peeking out at you from in the dark. Sometimes I like to hide little hidden characters, that sort of just like two little eyes down the bottom, just to sort of like that, so people don't notice at first, because it's quite nice then to feel that the more you look at a piece, the more it might reward you with something, deep, something that you weren't expecting, sort of hidden at the bottom, like little fairy houses and mushrooms and things. I quite like to slip those in from time to time, depending how sneaky I'm feeling. And why not? I think, a painting should reward you by the more you look at it, the more sort of things that you see that you didn't before. So I can see where I've left that white line there in between those two coloured lines, so I can get in the dark in between between them, and the white trunk looks like it's sitting in, it's further closer to us or further forward than the two sort of tonal red ones are. It kind of has that. So you've got the red trunks being, as I said, being sort of a middle tone, and the white ones that you're drawing being the sort of ones at front. And it helps give that sense of depth. I've got quite a big space here, so I think we might have to get a trunk into that for it to somewhere in there, so we can just see a bit of trunk coming down. And I don't mind it crossing behind a red one, because sometimes, they might be catching a sunbeam, they might be changing colour in different lighting conditions, or catching more or less of light. And I think this sort of has a really lovely, I think we can hopefully see this sort of sense of depth is really starting to work on this just by using these different amounts of lines. And again, as you come down to the bottom of the shape, it's easier to get your lines to converge and come together, so they almost become completely sort of black, and that gives it that lovely sense of depth and shadow. And by not doing them relentlessly all in the same direction, it stops it again from being too, it still keeps it on the side of being illustrative rather than just being naturalistic. Again, there's something wrong with painting in a very naturalistic way. We're just not really doing that today, so that's why we don't want to have that creeping into our pictures. So we're just going down, and as we go down into that shape, we can pack the lines tighter together and get a real sense of darkness. There we go, into that sort of shape, and we're still building up, we're still feeling that we're getting in. So we've got about, I suppose, roughly about 10 more minutes drawing time. Does anybody want to ask a question or get me to look at a particular part of the drawing, or ask how I might tackle a certain bit? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going, but do feel free to ask me if there's something you want to particularly look at, or you want to sort of focus on for a minute or two. And I will just take from the resounding silence that everyone's happy just to keep on for the last 10 minutes. Unless anyone does have something, do always ask. As I always say to people, if you're thinking, I want to ask that, you can be guarantee the person, other people are also wanting to ask the same thing, and they're just hoping that you do it so they don't have to, because we're ever so reticent about asking questions somehow. It's always that awful moment people say anyway to, would you like to ask me any questions? And your mind goes completely blank, and you think, I can, and then the moment you leave, 8 questions pop into your head that you wish you'd asked. So I'm just putting a little bit of shadow into the top of these trunks, and it just helps to show that they're coming underneath this sort of thick canopy. I'm going to try and fit another white trunk in between these two red ones. Let's squeeze that down. It's going to go on top because it's the one in front. It's pushing for the limelight. That's it. And then this one is going to be slightly behind, so it's going to tuck in behind that one. There we go. Just trying to follow that edge. I don't worry too much about perfection, as you've probably noticed by now. And you could get some more texture onto the birch trees once you've got all the shadowing in, so that they're all disappearing off into the inky blackness of the forest. The front ones, we can get quite a good effect of birch bark. I'll continue doing that shading in a minute. But if you get one of your finer pens, and I just zoom in on a bit of trunk. There we go. Just doing some little spaced out horizontal little scribbles like that, little tiny lines, not trying to be shading. So just some little mark indicators on there. That kind of has that feeling of silver birch bark, because they do that thing where the sort of grey underneath kind of breaks through the outside, and sometimes you get little, and maybe it's like a little couple of spots every now and again, or a line with some dots around it, and that really gives that feeling of birch bark. It's a very simple visual trick, but it's quite successful to do. It works quite nicely. And but if you were doing something more like an oak or beech tree, then you'd be looking at much more vertical kind of, or sort of patterns running down that kind of way, like wavy patterns. But with the birch trees in particular, you get these little horizontal, almost like scars across the surface. And as the tree gets older, these open out and you get more grey on the trunk and less silver, sort of like a sort of splitting a sort of snake skin kind of feel. But just in case you were interested, they're extremely versatile tree. They used to be used, you can tap the sap a bit like because they are related to maple trees, so you can tap the sap a bit like you do with a maple syrup tree. And the Vikings were big on birch syrup, because you can then ferment it into an extremely powerful drink, funnily enough. But yeah, birch sap wine is apparently quite, one of those sort of homemade wines that you have one glass of and think, oh, that's lovely, and then you stand up and the world goes sideways on you. And the skin itself is incredibly strong, or the bark, I suppose one would say, and you can make it into, just use it for making boats, because it's very flexible. You can almost stitch it together. Very useful stuff. That's why there are so many birch forests in Scandinavia, because they were very useful, and over here, very useful material. They grow very fast, and they're quite invasive. And foresters abouts will spend time in the autumn grubbing out quite a lot of birch trees, because they do take over. And of course, they're connected to the amazing fly agaric mushrooms, those classic toadstools that are red with the white dots on. They love growing in birch forests. They like the fall of the birch leaves, so they grow a lot in birch forest. So they're very connected to them. And they as well, if you I wouldn't recommend this. I don't know if I should say that loud, but don't eat them. Okay, but if you do eat them, don't eat them. But if you know what you're doing, you can eat them, and apparently they are quite powerful. And apparently this is what, but don't eat them, because they're also poisonous. So you have to know exactly what you're doing and be a Viking, I would imagine, before you can survive eating a fly agaric mushroom. But I'm sure neither of you are going to rush out and start eating fly agaric mushrooms. But please don't, because I get into trouble for encouraging you to do so. But no, I'm not encouraging it. I'm just saying that they're quite magical things, and they like birch forests. Right, so it's one of those moments where I'm just like, stop talking and carry on with the drawing. But yeah, so they're quite a magical tree. They're I think they are very beautiful, and they of course have this incredible foliage every year where they go into these amazing red and orange colours. And they have catkins in the spring as well. They're absolutely beautiful. And if you can get to see a birch forest in full autumn colour, it really is quite breathtaking. And of course, it only lasts for a couple of weeks, and then the winter wind comes and blows it all away. And I know near me is Blean Woods, which I occasionally go for walks in when I have the time, and I love. But one Christmas I went down, or autumn went down, and they were taking out loads of birch trunks, so quite skinny, lots of skinny, spindly ones. So I took about a dozen home, and then at Christmas time, I cable tied them all the way up the banisters in our house, and covered them all in fairy lights and gallons of white netting, so they looked like sort of they were in a misty winter scene. And then I got loads of cut out paper leaves, like autumn leaves, and covered the whole hallway floor in autumn leaves, and made lots of Christmas decorations that were all white with the faces of snow creatures like snowy owls and foxes and things on them, and put tree stumps everywhere to turn the house into a winter wonderland. It did look very nice, but it was a nightmare to clear up, but it did look lovely for a Christmas party one year. And lots of candles and sort of a slice of wooden decorations, and I made lots of fake fly Garrick mushrooms to go everywhere, because they're quite cheery actually, being red and white. They look quite Christmassy. So that was when I had more time on my hands, clearly. But if you do want to get yourself some birch trees, you usually get a load in the autumn, because they take them out of the woods. So, and they're quite good in gardens for adding height and things. Right, so I'm just going to, hopefully you start to really get that sense of these trees all packed into this space and this sort of slightly chaotic world beneath this sort of forest, beneath all this lovely colour. And I think that's really starting to work now, and showing how we can create this world from what is a very kind of abstract starting point. And as I was trying to say, it's just about thinking about the lines that you use and sort of what you're trying to convey with them. So they do two jobs the whole time. They're not just being shading lines in a sort of crosshatch way, and they're not just being decoration in a patterny way, but they're kind of coming together. So the patterns that you make help create the tone and the shading, and they also give a sense of what the surface is like of your objects, whatever object that might be. And I think just little hints of sort of bark to give little moments of reality, and sort of perhaps chucking a few little birds into the trees, all these sort of things just adds this sort of slightly surreal blend of understandable images and also slightly random ones as well. So, and that's where I think really good illustration lies, is between that blend of understanding, making recognizable drawings, but also playing with the viewer and playing with the lines and adding element of surface pattern decoration to turn it into something more than a photo. I think it's more than a photo. I think good art is more than a photo. I think great photos are art, but I think good art it should always give you that little bit more atmosphere and sense of place, and a sense of what the artist thought about what they were doing. That's what we hope to achieve anyway. And as well as making nice prints you might put on a biscuit tin. Why not? Why can't you have nice biscuit tins? The world needs nice biscuit tins. So I'm just going to put another long trunk in there, which will be a white trunk through, and if I want to do one over where it crosses over here, I can just turn that into a tonal moment, and that works just fine by me. Right, so I think that's probably as far as we can take this session, but I hope that you'll feel inspired to keep on drawing and create your whole forest kind of landscape. And I think when I've done all of this pen work in, I might be tempted to put a kind of sweep of blue watercolor across the sky, just to give it that very clear, not all the way down, but like at the top, just to give it that very clear autumn kind of sky feel. And there we go. So I'm going to stop the recording at that point.